Welcome back, team, for the next video in this series. As a reminder, this series is taking into account how do we transform or translate mathematical concepts and values between an equation to, let's say, a graph, to a table, and into like a situation or a word problem. And how can you take those things and be able to transform them into something else that gives us information or a different way of looking at the same information? So, can you take an equation, go to a graph, take an equation, go to a table? Maybe you take a table and want to come back to a graph or go to an equation, or just go ahead and make a word problem. How do you transform each of these things into one another to look at different parts of an equation, different parts of a graph, different parts of a table, different parts of a word problem for information that we can actually use? In the last video, you may have recognized that we had an equation that looked like this: 2x minus 1 equals y. And we took this opportunity to transform this equation, which let me label that right here, and equation. And we transformed that into a table, into specifically an XY table. And in this XY table, we set up with the -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. And we ended up solving for this, and we got -5, -3, -1, 1, and 3. And this was the table that we ended up transforming into. And let me just take this equation. Let me put it right above. Okay, so we took an equation, we transformed that into a table, and now we're ready to take this table and transform that into a graph. So in this video, we're going to be looking at how do you take a table and turn it into a graph. Making a table is not the hardest thing to do in the world. However, it is tricky at some time. And going from a table to a graph should feel a little bit easier, especially because this is some stuff that we should have learned either back in middle school, some of you even earlier than that. And it has to do with the main concept of plotting points. So from a table, we can plot points to graph. And so in this video, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking this table, I'm going to be creating some points, I'm going to be plotting them on this graph, and then hopefully we'll get to the point where we all can take a table and transform that into a graph. So let's get started. I always like to list out some steps that I use in specific video. Now, mind you that some of these steps may not apply to every situation out there, so be sure to take them with a grain of salt. They will help you in most situations, but in this specific example, when we're taking a table to a graph, these are the steps that I would follow. Okay, my first step: list out points from a table. Now, some of you may be saying to yourself, "Oh, Hernandez, this is easy. I can list points." But a lot of us tend to forget that a point consists of two different values, an x value and a y value. And we use these in order to plot them onto this graph. So you're going to hear me use a couple different words here: points, plotting, graphing. And we'll discuss kind of what I mean by all of those in just a little bit. So if I take this, we'll move it out of the way for right now. I'll move it right down here for right now. If we move that out of the way and we take all of these entries to the table and we turn each entry into a specific point, we would take the x term, in this case it's -2, put the -5 next to that, and we've just made something called a coordinate pair. In other words, a point, consisting of an x term and a y term. If you proceed doing this with every entry in this table, you would end up with 5 different points. Some of my previous students thought every single number represented a different point. While that could be the case, every point does need a second value to it in order for it to be a valid point, valid coordinate pair. So every single one of these entries would be considered a point or a coordinate pair. We're going to then use these and then graph them so that way we can get a better idea of how to go from a table to a graph. Once you have all the points listed out, I would do something. Make sure your graph is set up. You can't graph something unless your graph is actually set up. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to move my entire screen. I'm going to get nice and close to this graph, and I'm going to set it up for us so that way we can be successful. When we set up a graph, you may recall from class, we need to get our axes in check. The x-axis and the y-axis. We need to make sure that we scale appropriately. And then we need to label if needed. In this specific problem, going from our table to the graph, we don't need to label it because there's nothing that we're looking toward specifically in terms of content. So the only labeling that we're going to need, make sure you just label your x and your y. The horizontal line is always going to be your x-axis. The vertical line will always be your y-axis. And we're ready to start scaling. For those of you that don't remember, scaling consists of 2 pieces, equal spacing. You want to make sure that each one of these dashes is equally spaced physically when you're going to graph. You don't want to end up with a value here, looks good so far, and then just skip a little bit, and then maybe we'll just come a little bit closer and then skip all the way out here. You want to make sure that all of the line spacing is equal. So I just went ahead, I did this ahead of time. It looks pretty good, fairly good. Maybe a little bit of an error over here, but we'll fix that as we go. And you want to make sure that each dash has the same incremental amount. Incremental amount, which means you want each value to be increasing by the same amount each time. So in this case, we all know that 0, 0 is right in the middle. But if I come out here on my x-axis and I scale this by ones, I've immediately declared how much I'm incrementing this graph by. From 0 to 1 is a +1 increment, which means every single spacing in between the dashes needs to represent an increase of 1. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pen and I'm going to go up by 1 every single time. I'm going to come back the same way. I like to number out about 5 or 6 spaces out. And then if I need more as I go, then I will proceed forward and just keep adding them. Now I forgot a 4 in there. That's okay. I'm going to do the same with my y-axis. Each axis can have its own incremental amount. They both do not necessarily need to be the same. But in this problem, I'll treat them both as the same. I think we'll be okay. Okay. Step 3, you're going to start plotting some points. You're going to start plotting some points. Plotting points, you're going to start with your x. Start with your x value. which is on the horizontal axis, then your y value, which is vertical. Okay, so here, my first point that I have is going to be negative 2 comma 5. So I'm going to start at 0, 0, start right in the middle. I'm going to go back 2 spaces, 1, 2, and then I'm going to go up 5 spaces. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my point here would represent the coordinate point of negative 2. Oops. I wish I had students in class to call me out on my mistakes. We're going negative 2 spaces, and then we're going to go down 5 spaces. 3, 4, 5. Here's my point. Now, when you're going to plot points, you don't need that line that I just did. So this increment that I'm showing you, you don't need all of that. Typically, you'll go back 2, down 5, boom, get yourself a point. Negative 2, negative 5. You do the same thing with the next point, negative 1, negative 3. So you go back 1, go down 3. And I always like labeling my points. A lot of students tend to not label their points because they feel that they don't need to. You've graphed it once, you plotted it once, you're good to go. But I always label my points, especially if there's only 5 of them. It really helps me see where these numbers are and see where these values are. Okay, I went ahead, I grabbed 0, negative 1, so that's done, that's done, that's done. Then I have 1, 1. And then I have 2, 3. Now, I'm not going to put a fourth step here, but the fourth step that you could do is get yourself a nice ruler. Oops. Get yourself a nice ruler. Get it lined up with all of the points nicely, like something like that. And then you can go ahead and connect the points. Now remember, these are lines that we could potentially make longer than the amount of points that there are because the table that we had from before could have been extended even further. And we could take this table and add more rows to it to fill it in some more and make this line even longer. But in this case, I would just put little arrows at the ends signifying that this could go even further than needed. Okay. So we went from taking an equation, we turned this equation into a table that we can use. Now we're ready to graph. These are a few steps that you can use to graph. And then your graph looks something like this. Take your time in making graphs. They'll be really important moving forward in this year and understanding how to read a graph to find specific information from so that way you're successful when answering certain questions. Okay. With that, I'll catch you next time. Hope you enjoyed.